see, we're winding down here, a couple more chapters, and then we have a few topical classes on Acts. So just to kind of orient us as to what's going on in the world around Acts 26, this part of Acts. So this stuff down here, I mean, obviously we don't know nearly as much, exactly when the letters were written. Paul, some of his were written in the late 40s, maybe early 50s. Others, like many of these prison letters, often have been dated to this period or as trip to Rome, but as Sterling indicated a couple of weeks ago, that's not totally certain. If you read books like 2 Corinthians, you get an idea that maybe there were other participants that we don't know about and letters could have been written then. Or I should say we don't know much about it other than Paul mentions them in places like 2 Corinthians. But we do know these Roman emperors, we have their dates timed very well. And then these governors in Judea and Galilee, we have a pretty good idea. The exact date in which the Festus takes over for Felix is not known exactly, but it's in 59 to 60-ish. Coinage from that era sort of highlights when that is. And so, again, we're beginning to work toward this cataclysmic conflict between Jews and Rome. But this is leading up to that. And so Felix wasn't, as we've noted, really a very good person. And like many of the Roman governors, there was a lot of back and forth conflict with the Jewish authorities. The Jews weren't really loving having the Romans as their superior. Then Festus takes over, and so Paul has been left in prison, we see in chapter 5 for 2 years, because Festus, he seems to kind of be told a couple of different directions, but even though they often would kind of stick it to the Jewish population, in other ways they're trying to do things that made the Jewish population happy when they could, because the more negative comments that went to Rome, that didn't reflect well on governors like Felix. And so when they had a chance to do them a favor that really didn't cost them anything, they often might do that. And he does that, so then Festus takes over. And what has Paul done here? What do we see at the end of chapter 25? What has just happened? So Felix, excuse me, I can get these F names, but Festus takes over. And so Festus says, well, why don't you go back to Jerusalem and you can stand trial there? Paul says, well, he doesn't say it so many words here, but he knows, well, that's why I'm here. I'm not going to get a fair hearing there. And so he makes this appeal to go to Caesar. Roman citizens have the right to make an appeal for the case being heard. Now, as you can imagine, that could take a while knowing to get to Rome, but the emperor had many things on his agenda, so that's not an immediate. Okay, now Festus could have released him here for later. We'll talk about that. Even though he appealed, he could have released him, but there are reasons probably he wouldn't. What about this? And Dean mentioned this, and we ended with this on Sunday. Is Paul being cowardly in making an appeal to his Roman citizenship and his right to appeal to Caesar? Should a Christian always just say, hey, bring on the stones?
He's not getting a fair hearing where he's at.
Yeah.
So he wants to move it on.
Exactly. There's a well-known writer. He was a well-known expositor of Scripture. Some of you may know the name Martin Lloyd-Jones. He was a subsequent preacher following this guy. G. Campbell Morgan is his name. He said, You know, there are people today who seem to imagine they're never doing anything for God unless they're choosing the most distasteful line of action. He wrote this in 1924. It doesn't follow. If God's way for a man is to walk a pathway that is distasteful, then he must tramp it. But if God called him to walk in a path that's delightful, then he will walk that pathway with songs of gladness. We have no business to put ourselves in the way of suffering. Paul made his appeal to Caesar. He did not choose and was not called upon to choose in the service of his master and for the fulfillment of his purpose to hand himself over to the folly and brutality of men who had lost their sense of justice. Much of what Bob just said. You know, why hand myself over to people that I know want to kill me and want to be unfair to me? You know, we're not following Christ doesn't mean we should be flailing ourselves on the back and cutting ourselves with knives and seeking martyrdom and seeking suffering, but when it does come our way, to face it with faith and hope and trust. All right, so we have this scene. Agrippa, King Agrippa, we'll talk about in a moment, who has shown up on the scene, and Festus says, hey, why don't you listen to him? Now, this is not a trial. This is more of a hearing. This is saying, because why did Festus want Agrippa to hear Paul?
So he could have something to write to Nero about.
Yeah, well, he's going to Rome and he's appealing. He needs to have something to appeal. Right now, I don't have much. So Agrippa, I'm going to let you help me out here. And so, Lawrence, would you read what Paul says?
Then Agrippa said to Paul, "You have permission to speak for yourself." So Paul motioned with his hand, began his defense. "King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate to stand before you today as I make my defense against all the accusations of the Jews, and especially so because you are well acquainted with all the Jewish customs and controversies. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently."
So what's his tone here with Agrippa?
Respectful.
Respectful. It's interesting as we'll go through this. He continues to show respect, but will teach the gospel of Christ. And it's interesting how he frames this, but he shows respect to it. He speaks deferentially to his position, as he has Felix and Festus. So where else have we already seen this story that Paul is about to launch into? This is my quiz. This is our exam for the trimester.
Chapter 22.
Chapter 22, before Felix, the governor of Judea, and then earlier in chapter 9, where Luke just gives the account. They're very similar and overlapping, but each one gives a little detail that the other one doesn't, and we'll get into that as it goes on. So who is this? Who is Agrippa? King Agrippa. You know, the Romans allowed and conferred on certain leaders this honoring title of king. Well, you know, it was always confusing to me growing up, and even as an adult, sometimes you see Herod Agrippa, who are all these? And so we've mentioned this a few times. So Herod the Great is this maniacal, murderous person who is reigning over Judea during Christ's birth and childhood. Then Herod Antipas is one of his sons, who then is the Herod to whom Jesus appears and who cuts off the head of John the Baptist in that story. And then in Acts, we've already seen his son, or grandson of Herod the Great, Herod Agrippa I, who was a friend of Claudius, friend of Caligula, appointed. Where did we see him? What happened to him?
Eaten by worms.
Right, chapter 12, and he seems intent on killing and helping the Jews. It pleased him because it pleased the Jews. He goes, oh, I'm getting on board with this persecution and killing of the Jews and Christians, including Peter. He had killed James. He intended to kill Peter too. Peter is miraculously released. Herod appears before a group of people and gets these accolades of being like God, and the Lord strikes him dead over a few days. Dies a very horrific death. Even Josephus reports that. Well, his children include the Herod we now see. So Herod Agrippa is referred to as Herod in Acts. Luke refers to Herod Agrippa II as Agrippa. And so he's not the maniacal, murderous assassin that his grandfather or great-grandfather was, and probably a better person than the first Herod Agrippa. But, you know, his relationship with the Jews, again, was often strained. In many ways, he'd been put over the area of much of Galilee and Perea, certain other cities and areas, but it included the city of Jerusalem. And he had spent money on the city of Jerusalem to beautify it and projects. But he had also spent money on Gentile cities, particularly the city we now call Beirut, Lebanon. He spent money there. Well, the Jews were like, well, why aren't you spending that money down here? And he also had a habit of deposing a high priest with great frequency. And so that didn't endear him. Ultimately, when this Jewish war breaks out, he has to make a choice. Am I going to stick with the Jews, or am I going to help Rome? And he ends up sending troops to help squash the rebellion. And he spends much of the rest of his life in Rome. And so he sides with Rome in the Jewish war. You can see here, two of his sisters also figure in this later part of Acts. One of his sisters is Drusilla. Many of you can't see that, but she was the wife of Felix, younger than him. And his other sister is who? Well, yeah, Josephus says she's became his wife. You know, we don't know a ton about that, but you know, Acts just says she came in with him. But when this Jewish war breaks out and he heads back to Rome, she's with him. So it's weird. That's not the focus of Luke. So we'll move on here. So just a little background on Herod Agrippa. Sorry, Lawrence, if you would pick up there.
The Jewish people all know the way I have lived ever since I was a child, from the beginning of my life in my own country and also in Jerusalem. They've also known me for a long time and can testify, if they are willing, that I conform to the strictest sect of our religion, living as a Pharisee. And now it is because of my hope in what God has promised our ancestors that I am on trial today. This is the promise our 12 tribes are hoping to see fulfilled as they earnestly serve God day and night. King Agrippa, it is because of this hope that these Jews are accusing me. Why should any of you consider it incredible that God raises the dead?
You know, it's very likely, we could say, well, certainly, but you would think very likely that Agrippa knows something of Jesus and something of his story. Felix had heard about this story. Festus seems to be more ignorant of this. He doesn't seem to know much about it. But there's no way Agrippa could have lived in this region and grown up knowing about this region without hearing this. And so, in some ways, this is filling in maybe details that Agrippa would not have known. And so what does Paul, and he's done this back earlier too, but what does Paul lay claim to here? What's his approach?
Jew of Jews. He's a Jew of Jews.
Right, he's the Jew of Jews. You think about why might he need to give a little background on his background. How many years has it been now since this change in his life? 25 years-ish. Many of these people here, and certainly people like even Agrippa, may well not know much about Paul's past history. And so he's laying to, I know all about this. I'm not some, one writer said, he's dispelling the idea that, well, Paul, maybe he's just a Jew of the dispersion of Jews among the Gentiles. And he's one of the yahoos that just come up with crazy ideas. He says, no, I am a Jew of the Jews. I live the life that these people live. But then he takes it further and makes one further claim that is really at the root of what he'd said earlier to Festus and Abethus and his Jewish brethren.
Well, he was a Pharisee, and he was schooled under Gamaliel.
Right.
So
So
those are
right.
important things in his past.
Right. So he had this very strict upbringing, one that would have been highly respected. But what does he say here?
It's the very hope that the Jews have that he's on trial for.
Yeah, he says there's an irony here. I'm being put on trial for the promises and talking about the fulfillment of the very promises God has made to Israel. I'm the one who's defending God's promises. What would some of this problem? Well, I'll come back to that. Well, no, I do want to ask that here. Well, what did God promise the ancestors? If we went back to their deepest ancestor,
All nations would be blessed.
right? The beginning of the story of Israel in Genesis 12 begins with the promises to Abraham, and the most expansive of those is the last one, through you, all nations. And we often use the term Gentile, but in Scripture the word is usually equivalent to the word nations. All nations are going to be blessed through Abraham. There are certainly many other promises. Well, how are they going to be blessed? Well, again, he continues here. Lawrence, you pick up.
I too was convinced that I ought to do all that was possible to oppose the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And that is just what I did in Jerusalem. On the authority of the chief priest, I put many of the Lord's people in prison, and when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. Many times I went from one synagogue to another to have them punished, and I tried to force them to blaspheme. I was so obsessed with persecuting them that I even hunted them down in foreign cities.
This is very similar to what you see in Luke's account in chapter 9 and chapter 22, but in some ways even a little bit more forceful in his describing his own fervor and passions here. He says things like, I tried to force them to blaspheme. Why would he say that? How was he trying to force Christians to blaspheme? The Greek word here is actually essentially the Greek version of our word blaspheme.
Well, he just wanted us to say that they didn't believe in God.
Yeah, or particularly Jesus Christ. And so they wanted them to deny their very Lord and Master. And your version may say, force them, compel them, try. Again, how would one do that? What are the mechanisms to try to compel someone to deny them?
Give them an ultimatum. And they're life or
Right. Prison or deny or prison. Deny or you're going to be killed. Deny or your children will be taken away from you. Deny or your spouse will be thrown into prison. And these are not minor things. I'll just throw it as a little aside. And this goes back to what Lawrence was preaching a week or so ago on Ephesians 4, we should be very careful of looking down our noses at other people who confess Christ, particularly those who are doing it under threat of death. Do we really want to stand before the Lord who said to us, with the same judgment you use, you're going to be judged, and say, well, I don't know if that person knows as much as me. I'm not sure their faith is where mine. I've got the things that really matter. When they're about to have their head chopped off, there are people in the world and people in prison. And so that's a little side note. One word that he uses here is kind of interesting. How does he describe the depth of what he was going to? Of how deeply he was involved in this?
Hunting them down from city to city. I mean, Brian, it's a pretty incredible confession. Like, we can read this and we've all heard it and we know it, but, there were real people in Jerusalem that were impacted, that were still alive by these things that he did. And they would have hated him, right? I mean, at least at some point in their life they would have, but maybe they'd forgive him, maybe they'd moved past it, but like, this is a really incredible thing that he says there. I hunted them down from city to city.
Yeah,
Pretty incredible.
Yeah, he says in other places in his letters, I was a violent man. I was an insolent man. I was, think about often he's called the apostle of love. He was, Saul of Tarsus was the apostle of hate. Whatever he could say, whatever we sometimes, again, I think attribute too much. You've probably heard me say this, two statements like, I did it all good conscience. Well, he's not absolving it. Well, therefore, it really wasn't that bad. He's just saying, I wasn't being hypocritical about it in doing terrible, awful things. When he described himself as hunting them down, being a violent man, and he used the word, I was so obsessed with persecuting them. Many verses I was looking that would use words like so angry or so upset. But actually the word here, probably the closest, at least in the modern Greek, is a word like obsessed. In fact, if you translate this with Google Translate, it comes up being drunk with. He was being drunk. He was drunk on the blood of Christians. I mean, like Mike said, this is a deep confession of sin and guilt. But he goes on and gives the event that changed his life.
On one of these journeys, I was going to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priest. About noon, King Agrippa, I was on the road. I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, blazing around me and my companions. We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. Then I asked him, Who are you, Lord? I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, the Lord replied.
Yep, the more as I've taught Revelation together, and I've kind of described it at times as the first century version of an epic film. It gives some very stark graphic visualizations of the appearance of Jesus. This would be a great scene if you have unlimited budgets, and I could give it to Harry to be the producer and director of doing. This scene needs CGI and everything we can throw in. I think begin to get a sense of how tremendous, awe-inspiring. But it adds one thing here that's not said in the other two accounts. It's this, where Jesus says, it's also, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goats or pricks. So, again, some of you may have heard me say this before. As a kid, I always thought he was saying, it's hard for you to keep pricking me. But no, he's saying it's hard for you to keep pricking against the goads against you. Why would Jesus say that? It's a bit cryptic and ambiguous. We don't know exactly, but what are these goads? What has been pricking and sticking Paul?
Paul was a conscientious person that he described himself to be. even though he was fervent in his opposition to the Christians, I think from what he sees in their character, all along the way, he's probably being struck by that.
Yeah, but just because people continue in their violence, does that mean they're not conflicted? In fact, when they become more conflicted, that may in fact increase at times. I'll use arguments from my own life with this, beginning to realize you're wrong doesn't immediately make you back off and back down. At least that's my confession for the night. Right, so,
Well, that's so true. And like in the story of Stephen's stoning, where we're first introduced to Saul as being there, I think, and I won't go into the details, I think there's a good case can be made that Saul was probably one of those that Stephen had been debating. And it says that they could not resist the spirit and the wisdom with which Stephen spoke. And you can imagine a man of Saul's training and intellect getting bested by this man who serves tables as a deacon in the church, and yet Paul can't answer him in debate, and just allowing that rather than converting him to enrage him. And that would be a goad, I think, that is pushing against. And like you say, just because when you know you haven't answered your opponent,
right.
you don't just necessarily change sides, but you do fester and get angry or something.
Right. I had not thought about the thing you said until this was many years ago. There was a movie about, or a series on Acts, and they portrayed it as so that Stephen and Paul knew each other and were somewhat friendly. But then Stephen becomes honored Christianity and begins doing the very thing you're saying, and begins driving a wedge between them, which you can imagine again, that both make Paul angrier, but as the years go on, also begin pricking his conscience, because he is speaking the truth. Then when you're in the presence of someone actually saying what the Holy Spirit is guiding you to say, you have to be very callous not to be impacted to some extent. All right. So we go on here. Orange. Can you see that?
Yeah, I think so. Now get up and stand on your feet. I have appeared to you to appoint you as a servant and as a witness of what you have seen and will see of me. I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. I am sending you to them to open their eyes and turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me.
And so here's, in many ways, the message that had enraged out in Jerusalem. I think in many ways what had made the Sanhedrin so upset with him. It's one thing to say Jesus is here to save Israel. It's another thing to say he's here to make Israelites and Gentiles put them on the same footing. And he continues, he says, so then, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the vision of heaven. First to those in Damascus, then to those in Jerusalem, and in all Judea, and then to the Gentiles. I preached that they should repent and turn to God and demonstrate their repentance by their deeds. That is why some Jews seized me in the temple courts and tried to kill me. But God has helped me to this very day, so I stand here and testify to small and great alike. Remember what Jesus said Paul would do? He would stand before kings and rulers. And he stood before average people. He's standing for governors. He's standing for leaders of cities. He'll ultimately stand before the most powerful person in the whole world, and deliver the message of Jesus. And even if those people aren't converted, what we know ultimately is standing before Nero and being in Rome, who does that ultimately influence? He talks about this in Timothy.
household of the emperor.
Right, the very household of the emperor, people like her. So even if Agrippa or Festus or Felix, if their heart isn't turned to God, or Nero, other people that are hearing this are influenced. And then he continues, and this is very interesting. I think this really brings it back to his main defense. I'm saying nothing beyond what the prophets and Moses said would happen, that the Messiah would suffer, and as the first rise from the dead, would bring the message of light to his own people and to the Gentiles. So when he says, I'm saying nothing beyond what the prophets and Moses said would happen, where does Moses say this? What books did Moses write? Well, the first 9 books. As Jamie said a while ago, we've already mentioned one of the most prominent in Genesis 12, all the nations will be blessed. Not just Israel, all the nations. But what about other writers? What about in the prophets? Especially using some of the language phrases that he uses here. Where do we see those phrases? That he would bring the message of light to his own people and to the Gentiles. Remember, both Isaiah 42 and Isaiah 49 specifically refer to this servant, special servant, being a light to the Gentiles. Now again, I think Jews in Jesus' era often interpret that as, well, they're going to come to see that we should be ruling over them and they should be following our path. I don't think they saw that as we're going to be brethren and on the same level. But think about this. Again, we try to emphasize this as we go along. This is a message not just recounting things in real time for the people as it's happening. Luke is choosing these episodes to relate to Theophilus and people that he would have distributed this to, maybe Roman and Greek friends of his and friends of theirs. So what message is here for those people? Why would Luke emphasize something that seems like, well, wait a minute, this is something that convinced Jews. Why include this? I'm not as good as some and just let it stay quiet forever, but we'll give you guys a chance to answer on this.
Well, apparently Theophilus and those of his friends were Gentiles. This is a message for them.
This message, again, I think for many Romans and Greeks, why are Romans and Greeks being pulled into a Jewish religion, a Jewish sect, even a little part of the Jewish religion? Why is this Paul sitting? This is a message that's for the Gentiles, and it has always been a message for the Gentiles. Again, Romans might not have known much about the Hebrew Bible, but most of them would have been aware, if they had any contact with Jews, that there are Hebrew scriptures, there are Hebrew prophets, and Paul has been claiming these ancient prophets in Israel have been talking about bringing in you Gentiles since the very inception. And in fact, while it doesn't emphasize Gentiles per se, this is the message of Jesus' walk with the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, that these scriptures all speak of me. And so, again, this isn't so much, when Paul delivered these words, there were many Jews listening. It's a message for them, but this is Luke letting Paul speak through and to someone like Theophilus. And then, beyond that, to people like us today. Now, again, as Christians, I think now we none of us challenge the idea of, well, yeah, I'm not Jewish, but this isn't for me. We accept that. But this is a world-changing view that people like us are part of the hummus. Right? And then, at this point, Festus interrupts Paul's defense and says, you are out of your mind and you've gone mad, Paul. Your great learning is driving you insane. Sort of interesting, right? And there are different suggestions. Why might Festus jump in? Well, you think about, well, what's Paul been saying? Well, hey, this message I've been testifying about, that what Jesus has said here might cause Festus to go, that's crazy.
Same thing that happened in Acts 17 at the Areopagus when he said the resurrection from the dead, people began to mock.
I think that strikes me as the most obvious, that even though Festus had a sense, as we see in chapter 25, well, this man says, talks about some dead man who's supposedly alive. That's different than all actually now saying it. He's like, hey, look, that the Messiah would suffer and be the first to rise from the dead. Now, others have suggested this is, and maybe this is right too, that this is getting a little too personal now. Paul, you think about it, he's begun turning the tables here. This is not merely a defense of any charges against him. He is actively appealing to and trying to convince Agrippa. And Festus, it begins to be a little embarrassing. Wait a minute, I didn't bring Agrippa here for you to convert him to your religion. So maybe that's part of it too.
If he lets it play out, if this truly is the king, then what's he going to write to Caesar?
Yeah. That somebody see. I'm glad you mentioned that, Scott, because he begins thinking, wait a minute. If I say, hey, well, I'm going to come back to that. So Paul says, I'm not abstaining, most excellent Felix. What I'm saying to you is true and reasonable, and the king is familiar with these things, and I can speak to him. I'm convinced that none of this has escaped his notice because it wasn't done in a corner. He knows about it. And this is one of the fundamentally important things about Christianity. This isn't some third, fourth, fifth heaven story that happened in the mountains of Nepal and somehow it's filtered out. These things are known, and eyewitnesses exist, and it's not a secret. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. Well, this kind of comes to Scott's point. Well, if that begins to put the hit on Agrippa, what's Agrippa going to say now? If he says, well, yes, I do, what does that at least indicate or intimate? Well, I'm agreeing with you, Paul. Okay, yeah, this is, well, I'm not wrong. On the other hand, he says, no, I don't. Well, who does that turn off? Well, the Jewish authorities. So Agrippa kind of wiggles out here and says, Paul, do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian? And over the years, sometimes it's been taken as a sincere statement, in other ways taken as a sarcastic way of getting out from underneath Paul's question that put him in a bind. But Paul replies, whichever way it is, Paul replies sincerely. He says, short time or long, I pray to God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for these chains. So in some ways, there's some degree, some suggestion of even levity in what he's saying. Well, while he's serious, he's saying, hey, Agrippa, I see you don't want to ask me a question, but really, I would like you to be like I am, except obviously for these chains. And then, think about this. I think the key here, this refers back to chapter 5. Felix, this is when he's talking to Agrippa, he says they had some points of dispute with him, about Paul, about their own religion, about a dead man named Jesus who claimed was alive. Well, here's a quote again from G. Campbell Reagan. If Paul had not believed that the one Jesus, he's using a different version, was alive, then not a single chapter of Paul would have been written. These chapters that we have, Acts, the letters of Paul, if Christ isn't risen, none of that, Paul would not have written that. And see, so the truth lies, live the resurrection out of this chapter and out of this book and out of the history of the centuries, and what remains? Well, the cross, but what does the cross become without the resurrection? As it calls it, a catastrophe, an injustice, but nothing else. The cross and the resurrection together, that's the center of what our faith is in. And this becomes the very centerpiece of the message of the gospel of the book of Acts. And like we noted, it's what convinced some people to say, hey, this is it. And it caused other people to say, you people are crazy. But Luke, over and over again, and I think this is the Lord's choice ultimately, he has chosen the biggest opponent that you could choose of Christianity to go out and say, no, I was wrong. Jesus of Nazareth really did rise from the dead. And so I think that speaks not to just Agrippa, not to just Theophilus or friends of his. It speaks to everyone in every era, in our era. What are you going to decide about the testimony of Saul of Tarsus? Is he a madman who made all of this up? Is he doing this somehow for some weird personal gain that isn't obvious? Is he just some fictional character? That doesn't seem like a telling position. Or did he really encounter a light on the road to Damascus and the voice of Jesus himself? Those are the options, really. Either he just made this up for whatever reason, insanity, or this is the truth. And this is what Luke keeps presenting through the book of Acts, especially this section of the book of Acts, as why we're here. And we should never lose sight of it. We're not here because of family heritage. That may have begun us down the road. We're not here because of some functionality Christianity gives us. We're here because people like Saul of Tarsus said, Jesus of Nazareth was crucified and was resurrected. And that has saved us. That's shown power. Well, again, I give you about 15 seconds. So anybody want to add anything? Gary?
Well, to the audience of Theophilus, we now have the authorities of Pilate, Festus, Felix, Agrippa.
Yeah,
also,
that was actually my next slide. Thank you. Yeah, Luke keeps giving us Roman officials testifying that Paul is innocent of any criminal wrong. Thank you. Thank you, Paul.